Hi, so this is the Q&A video for 1K subs. I hope this doesn't end up being anyone's first impression of me somehow, but maybe it's my truest self. Enjoy some meaningless background content I haven't decided on yet while I answer these questions from you, the viewers. If I hadn't thought of this only just now, I would have made some kind of Eurovision joke in presenting these questions, but it's too late for that. Missing No asks, which area of history do you find most interesting? Oh man, this is a tough one. I bounce around a bit. Sometimes a region or a time period becomes my new thing for a month or year or whatever. It's kind of why I get stuck with these hyper-specific moods of, man, I wish there was a game that really zeroed in on delivering the experience of a grand strategy game about the revolutions in Mexico, or something. I've spent a lot of time on the Weimar era of Germany and learning about the decline of the Republic, and one of my favorite writers whose work I'm probably going to do a video on someday is also very interested in this period. I don't have a home, so my bookshelf is rather small, and I don't tend to keep too many things, so I can't just look at the shelf for guidance on answering this question. I think the HRE is fun, but my higher education didn't offer anything with any depth in Europe before 1750, and usually they still jumped hard into the 1800s and beyond, so I've never actually studied the HRE in any formal capacity. Late Imperial China was cool. The rise of the Qing Empire is so dramatic and triumphant, it could probably be a TV series. Huang Taiji and the Fall of the Ming is all just a cool story. Like Code Geass for people who can read. Normac023 asks, about the connections of IR realism and 4X and the origins of the genre and how those things impact the genre moving forward, to be brief. I think these games are never really built with diplomacy as a primary function, and that probably does have a lot to do with the 4X roots. This may deviate from the question a tiny bit, but I think playing tall is kind of a response to these old genre elements. I think players often yearn for more methods of interaction with the game than press button receive warfare. I think that's why Hoi 4 falls aggressively flat for some people, and why the Hoi 4 of Napoleon, March of Eagles, is like an entirely forgotten game. I know lots of people play these games as map painters, for sure, but there's also a shift in the genre at large to flesh out things like trade and diplomacy. Video games in general have kind of prioritized violence as gameplay since the start, because it's really easy to demonstrate feedback for that kind of play. I think the majority of the 4Xs have reached points of diminishing returns in terms of gameplay innovation, while the expanding complexity of things like diplomacy and trade have good places to go. For an example of this, humankind's trade system and the idea of embargoes, wielding trade as a diplomatic weapon, is something players seem to really enjoy. I think culture and diplomacy wins have the potential to be interesting, but we've just had years where that content hasn't been prioritized, so it looks lame, and then it doesn't get priority, and there's just this immediate stagnant cycle. It always kind of feels passive and underwhelming, but then again, I think win conditions are something to be avoided in history games for the most part, so I'll say this. The things I love about Civ are the sandbox, not the victory conditions. I've never in my life met someone who cares about score in EU4. There's not even a single achievement that acknowledges score. I think the genre might split, with part of the genre being less about win conditions and more about player-driven experiences and narratives, kind of like what CK3 is built on. There are some other games I'm aware of that do this, but that's a subject for another day. This guy asks, music at the end, question mark? I've gotten questions about the music more than once, and I just wanted to point out here real quick that unless I mess up, I like to include the names of the tracks at the end of the video around the sources and credits. They're not time-stamped, but they do go in order of appearance. Let me know if I should be more specific with presenting them. The Common Cliché asks, do you have an opinion on Victoria 3 with current development diaries, or do you think it's best to wait for the game to be released? I think the dev diaries and monthly updates are fine to follow, and given that I've made a video about one and plan to make one more at some point before release, I think they're a good source for hype and discussion. But I'm also very resistant to hype as a person, and I don't know if it's because of that or not, but I'm trying to hold back on forming an opinion until reviews are a thing. Even then, Paradox games always change and update. As an aside here, the fact that Imperator stopped getting support was almost a comfort in a weird way, because it meant that the game was just done, you know? Ask someone how it is, and there's a kind of definitive answer. Ask someone how EU4 is, and it depends on the patch, what month it is, if Johan saw his shadow, etc. Maybe if my channel does well, Paradox will notice me and give me a key, and then I can be cutting edge when I offer an opinion on a game around launch instead of 4 to 10 years late. Wigglefig asks, what are your favorite history paper author names? Which is a pretty weird question, but I actually had an answer come to mind pretty quickly, and it's not just making fun of a guy. It's not exactly a paper, and I intend to discuss him at a later point, but I've always found it kind of funny that there's some guy in American Soviet historical study named Robert Conquest. I know that sometimes names like Slaughter are last names in the Anglosphere, and sure, those are funny, but I haven't ever met a Conquest, and I feel like it's a wasted opportunity he didn't go into writing about, like, the Mongols or something. It feels like he picked a historian's equivalent of a rock star stage name. Coat of Arms asked, how would having 300 tribes that will be steamrolled by even medieval nations really benefit the game? Oh wait, this isn't a serious question, nor is it directed at the Q&A. Well, actually, this is a good opportunity to talk about the reaction to my video, and indeed some of the reactions I see to other ones. For the most part, people are smart, nice, civil, and don't imply dismay that video games aren't catering to white supremacist ideology. And I'm very willing to accept criticism and disagreement with my points, but there's something different about comments like these, and there were a lot of them. They're not intended to start discussion. I would say it's a bit ironic that, when making the video, I was actually more afraid of misinterpretation from the other direction. That people on the left would misunderstand my Eurocentric lenses have their uses as colonialism apologia or something. That said, I anticipated a few comments calling me an SJW cuck or whatever because I dared to use the word Eurocentrism, but not the sheer number of people who would get into a fight with their interpretation of my thumbnail. So it's funny to me to see so many people stormed in to tell me how much they think Victoria 3 is doomed just because they boarded an anti-hype train when they saw a woman with blue hair presenting the community updates. I'm spending a lot of time on this question without answering it, so let's do just that for a second. Let's humor Mr. Arms, the Germanophile. It benefits the game by improving the presentation of history. That's most of the point of my video. Easier and better to leave it uncolonized is a really weird phrasing. Unless these commenters know something I don't about the inner workings of the game and Paradox's game development cycle, resource, and budget, this is just baseless speculation about the architecture of the game and how close it's pushed to its limit for the sake of promoting their weird agenda. They're probably not even sure why they're mad at this point. I could literally make the same point about EU4's HRE. Why bother including more states in the updates? The game already chugs and the HRE always coalesces into like 5 countries by endgame anyway. It's a foolish argument to make, built on a fallacious assumption that somehow performance is hurt, or that it would be more accurate to keep a blank map because these people who existed don't deserve representation? Because they didn't have appropriately organized nations or something? I don't know. This isn't a debate stream, and I don't trust their arguments are made in good faith, seeing how many of them just kind of fall back on the assumptions about mechanics as a shield for a curious distaste. Anisodemus asks, what's your personal view on the philosophy of history? And ultimately, how does it compare to figures like Spengler, Marx, Hegel, etc.? I guess on some level I'm stuck to avoiding any kind of generalizations, and as such, I'm sort of left in the condition of history is entropic. It's a struggle between states and actors, people and power, power and powers, but it's also heavily narrativized. We can't help construct narratives, if that makes sense. I think we should generally stick to looking backwards and at the present. Projections of the future and where we're headed are always ready to be derailed or self-fulfilling. I mean, in Spengler's case, fascist organizations used him as justification for their autocratic desires. I think when approaching these notions, my personal perspective is to first divide them into emancipatory versus the long shadow, something I briefly touched on in the Fukuyama vid. Is someone's prediction of the future acting as a desire towards something, or as a prophecy of decay? Are the steps provided? Are they saying, and we're nearly there, or are they saying, these things take time? Stuff like that can tip you off to an angle being played. Hegel and Marx at least weren't writing as though they were in the middle of the last step and that there was nothing to be done. I don't know if that's the most satisfying answer, but I also find more appeal in discussing how we do history and how we present it than on presuming endpoints. Some random guy on Reddit maybe a year ago or something asked, "Your name from Trinity Blood by any chance?" To which I respond, maybe? It's unclear. I've had this question come up once or twice before from total strangers, because before the channel I used it as an online name. Here's what I know for sure. I picked the name because I wanted something old world, real sounding, and also unique. I wanted something that wasn't just name comma bunch of numbers, and I think I did watch Trinity Blood sometime before picking it, but in the end, that anime is just kinda okay. I'm sure there's some alternate reality where my choice of name was dictated by Trigun, and I ended up naming myself after the weird, edgy cake guy. What I'm sure of is that it's a misspelling / malforming of Christian Rosenkreuz, and I embraced that element of it too. I find esoteric cults amid a secularizing world to be fascinating, and I might even eventually make a video about them. Apologies to anyone who may have found this channel early on and expected a Rosicrucian news digest or something. The possibility exists that I heard the name from Trinity Blood, and then looked into it and found the same inspiration they used in the show and was like, yeah, that's me now, cool. I wish I could say it was just me trying to be cool in RuneScape, but sadly that's not the case. WRJ Tung asks, where did you get your profile picture? And the picture is something I made, actually. It's an abstraction of the White Rose Memorial in Munich. I shopped around a bit for what angle to use in making the symbol, and the Wikipedia example really felt the most rosy, though I'm sure it's abstract enough that no one would say, ah yes, a geometric rose thing on first glance. Some people have said it reminds them of a brain, and that feels dorky. I'm not some glasses nerd science channel pretending to grow your brain in 15 minutes or less, or something. It turned out minimalist enough that it's a weird symbol, complex enough that it doesn't look like someone sucking off a giraffe like Resident Evil 6, and unique enough that I think it's got branding to it, so to speak. It's also a bit too complex, I suppose, in that it's not easy to just replicate, for better or worse. Hopefully I never get sued by whoever took the picture Wikipedia uses, though I'd argue it's absolutely transformative. I don't know why I worry about things like this. I'm sure this can prompt follow-up questions, so feel free to ask those too. Life Uncovered asks, have you ever taken an advanced history class in high school or college? Yes. I've liked history for a long while. While I was in high school, they only had like 4 history classes one could take, and the only elective choices were between advanced or regular. I was so desperate to get more history that I baffled my teacher by taking both regular and advanced classes at once. High school / secondary school in the US doesn't tend to provide students with a lot of room for options. In college, history was my major, so there's that. I even got to specialize a bit and focus on 20th century authoritarian states, almost by accident really. DatCat asks, what will you be making next, and do you have plans to create a Patreon? Patreon? I don't know. This was posted before the Fukuyama vid, so that's technically the answer of what was next. What's next is possibly a Stellaris video, cause I got a review key and I have some thoughts. It won't be super connected to history, but in general, my videos aren't supposed to solely center on history and games. The channel is more generalist than I've been making it lately. Hopefully that doesn't scare people away. The core thread is still going to be analysis and thinking about design when applicable, or talking about some historical concept or event, like a possible Mishima vid later. The future includes things as varied as a video on the Fable series, a conspiracy theory I have about Fallout 4, a discussion of Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines and Evil, the American esoteric cults of the early 20th century, my personal experiences with cryptocurrency grifters all the way back in 2016, the concept of socialist realist art, and the American anthrax scares of the 2000s, and a lot of other stuff. I'll absolutely be returning to history games though. I've got a rough outline of a season 2, so to speak, for the Doing History series. As for the second question I've conspicuously included here, yes. In fact, I've made one in conjunction with this video so that it wouldn't be just a loose eventuality, and I would force myself to do it now rather than never. I'll link it below. Also, tell me what I should do with it maybe. The way it is now isn't set in stone. That said, I wanted to clarify the scope of my channel before anyone... Oh well, one Polish guy somehow found it early. I wanted to clarify my channel's scope before people signed up, because I don't want people coming in thinking I'm going to exclusively tie myself to the grand strategy game niche or history, and then feel betrayed when I make a video about the Blade Runner game or art history or whatever. Raf Kim asks if there's some kind of ideology with which I approach the topics of my videos, and I can't really give a good answer to my own politics and how they align with the world, because at least where I live, there's no political party that I feel represents me well. I'm too picky and too much of a smug contrarian to align well, I guess. In fact, I have a hard time with identities in general. So yeah, there was once a lawyer who Hitler had a personal grudge with, and there's a funny story behind it all, but as much as it sounds like a dorky, cliche, aloof intellectualism, he had this quote about belonging to a political party with one member and feeling that even that was too many people. I guess it slightly resonates. It came to mind at least. As an important tangent, I know it might come across that my lack of identification is some form of political cowardice or a weak attempt at being neutral, but really, I'd rather my views be expressed in the content of videos than conjured in a stated ideology that needs like 4 asterisks after it. I respect creators who make neutral or benign content and let their views be known elsewhere, making use of their platform though. The Victoria 3 video getting, politicized responses was a good and important thing to have happen kinda early, and it probably caused any of the more fascistically inclined subscribers to leave, if they existed at all. As for a philosophy by which I approach my work, with videos and writing and poetry even, I've always liked the way Lyotard, the French guy from the Fukuyama vid, framed things in terms of doing justice to the representation of something. That doesn't mean like always acting with a judicious mind or fighting for the betterment of the world type justice, mind you. It's like to see something presented correctly, to really show what you mean, to let things take their best form. And while I'm far from a perfectionist, it does come out in my desire to articulate things. It also touches my approach to history, which you may note as a trend in the videos is that I favor accuracies over abstractions when I can. I'm not unreasonable in this though, I think. Like, I'm not going to rage at Paradox because they didn't put 300 plus tags in the HRE. It's why I use the term truism so often. Look, I just think people are far less attached to false perceptions than we assume. And all it takes is a bit of effort, and being a semantic dork, and we can finally get people to stop making PowerPoints about the 1792 French Revolution with this picture. S7 Robin and Königsberg Marshall basically asked, why? Why are you doing this? And these two go together. Video essays are something I consume a fair bit, and I've always been opinionated in a way that tended towards long-form fleshed out thoughts, some might call them rants, rather than having a quick word. So it's a mix of interest and an outlet. I once had a blog or two, and just like, there was no traction, but it was also just a bit unengaging. I'd write something and throw it out there into the world, and that was it. Actually, I think what started the blog was an effort to stop writing Facebook rants and spare my friends my yearly diatribes on the anniversary of different political events. I didn't really have experience making videos before this, no film school or editing class or even like Photoshop experience. The start was rough because of that, and I'm still learning things. As possibly self-absorbed as it sounds, I wanted to put my opinions out into the world and hear what people thought in turn. And I've always been just confident enough to speak, I guess. Oh, also, when I was still like a teenager, I had a friend of a friend from Norway just constantly telling me she thought I should do YouTube and have a vlog because I was funny or whatever, and I don't want to let her down, so I'm doing YouTube, but I also don't want to validate her, so I'm not vlogging. So now I want to introduce a section that I plan to have feature in future update videos or streams or however I plan to do it, where the limited Patreon tier gets to submit subjects for me to needlessly rant on, constructing an opinion from thin air, or on occasion expressing that I have some undeserved but very strong opinion on something that might be general or might even be hyper-specific. Here's 2 examples. So like desk lamps, I don't really understand why so many desk lamps have to have that like bright green kind of army jeep color, like it's from the 50s or something, but I mean, not the lamp, the jeep. It's never really made much sense to me, like that's just a strange design choice, and I mean, we're like in a world where people have apartments with plants all over them now, and plants don't get that color, so it just kind of stands out in a really weird evergreen kind of way, and like not like a healthy plant way, but like a plastic army man way. And even when people have desk lamps that are like a normal color, they're really often like hyper bendy and supposed to be able to like move over what you're doing, but like who the hell resets their desk that often? Okay, so cicadas in anime, I don't like I get what they're doing. I know that Japan has this thing where cicadas come out in the spring and summer. I've played Animal Crossing. I understand that that's the bit, and what they're showing is that it's, I don't know, warmer out and whatever, but they always do this thing where they'll like pause and like zoom out and show you that a cicada is chirping somewhere, and it doesn't actually mean anything, because like half the time it'll be like, oh, they were at home having a conversation and this is the screen transition. But then like the other half the time it's to intentionally show that they've gone hiking or something. Like, I get it, it's a kind of Japanese thing, or like, I don't know, temperate climates rise up. It's a silly little thing. It's a silly anime trope, and I don't understand exactly what it's supposed to convey. I get like a very, very loose sense, but for the most part, that's usually things that are conveyed in other ways, and I don't know, maybe it's like a gag I don't get? Is it a gag? Yeah, okay, so my idea with these things going forward and with other Q&As, and not that this is gonna matter super often, is that I'd kind of like the questions to be something everyone can ask. Like, I guess if someone's more curious about something that happened in a video or whatever, I don't want them to feel like they have to, like, get in on a Patreon tier to, like, just ask me something, you know? That said, I can only really do so many rants at once, and without making an entirely separate video that's just like 50 minutes of them, so I've decided to limit that to a tier, if that makes sense. Hopefully it's not disappointing that I'm a deeply ineloquent person when it comes to things I'm taking less seriously. I've never really been like a public speaker or debater in a strict sense, though I do get into frequent arguments with random people whenever I have the opportunity, and had a lot of opportunity to do that when I was a bartender, so I'm not like afraid of the public speaking part so much as like the idea that I have like a script or something that I'm not following. That bugs me. I'm not really sure how to end a video like this, so I'm just probably gonna call it here. I know that most people would probably have been like, that's all the Q's to A, bye, but I apparently did not do that, and maybe I'll never learn.